The scream came from the top of the staircase, sharp enough to stop every conversation in the mansion. Vanessa Kingsley stumbled backward down 2 steps, her hand pressed to her chest, her face twisted with disgust rather than fear. Behind her, 6-year-old Lily Calloway stood frozen at the top of the stairs, her small fists clenched around the hem of her dress, her mouth open in a silent, trembling shape that never turned into a word. "She threw a shoe at me," Vanessa said, her voice climbing into a shriek. "An actual shoe. At my face." Damien Calloway crossed the marble floor in long, furious strides, but his anger was not aimed at his daughter. He looked up at Lily first, checking her face, her hands, the way her shoulders curled inward like she was trying to disappear into herself. Only then did he turn to Vanessa. "She's 6, he said, his voice flat and cold, "and she hasn't spoken in over a year. You knew that when you agreed to come here tonight." "I knew she was shy," Vanessa snapped, smoothing down her expensive dress. "Nobody told me she was violent." "She is not violent." Damien's jaw tightened. "She is grieving." Vanessa opened her mouth to argue, but the sound of heels on marble cut her off. Margaret Calloway appeared from the drawing room, her silver hair pinned into a perfect twist, her expression calm in a way that made the room feel colder rather than calmer. "What happened?" Margaret said. It was not a question. It was a demand, dressed as one. "Your granddaughter attacked me," Vanessa said. "She threw a shoe," Damien corrected. Glancing up the stairs again, Lily hadn't moved. A nanny appeared behind her, gently placing a hand on the girl's shoulder, and Lily let herself be guided away without a sound. Margaret watched the exchange with narrowed eyes, then turned to Vanessa, with the practiced warmth of a woman who had spent decades managing other people's feelings for her own benefit. "I am so sorry, dear. She has been difficult since her mother passed. It's nothing personal." "It felt personal," Vanessa muttered, snatching her coat from the waiting butler. "This is the second time she's done something like this to me. I don't know why you keep insisting I come back." "Because you are exactly what this family needs," Margaret said smoothly. "I'm leaving," Vanessa said. And this time nobody stopped her. The front door shut with a bang that echoed through the entrance hall, and for a moment, nobody spoke. Damien rubbed his temples. 12, that was the number now. 12 women his mother had introduced into his home over the past 14 months. Each one selected for her family name, her social standing, her photogenic smile. 12 women who had each, in their own way, made his daughter retreat further into silence. Vanessa was simply the loudest about her failure. "You cannot keep doing this," Damien said, turning to his mother. "Doing what? Trying to find you a wife who understands what it means to run this family?" Margaret's voice sharpened. "Someone has to think about the company, Damien, about Lily's future. You cannot raise a daughter alone forever, hiding behind grief like it's some kind of shield." "This is not about the company." Damien's voice rose for the first time. "This is about a little girl who hasn't said a word since she watched her mother die, and every single time you bring one of these women into our home, she gets worse. Not better, worse." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. She needs structure, consistency. A mother figure who can guide her the way Vanessa or Charlotte or any of the others could have. "None of them wanted to be her mother," Damien said. "They wanted to be my wife. There's a difference, and Lily can tell. Children always can." He didn't wait for a response. He walked up the stairs 2 at a time, following the path his daughter had taken, leaving his mother standing alone in the grand entrance hall, with her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. Lily's room was dim, lit only by a small lamp shaped like a crescent moon. She sat on the edge of her bed, her legs swinging slightly, a stuffed rabbit clutched against her chest. The nanny, a kind older woman named Colette, sat beside her, humming softly, not pushing for words that wouldn't come. "Thank you, Colette," Damien said quietly. "I'll take it from here." Colette nodded and slipped out, closing the door with a soft click behind her. Damien sat down on the bed, leaving space between himself and his daughter, the way the therapist had taught him. He didn't reach for her right away. He simply sat, letting the silence settle, letting her know he wasn't going anywhere. "I'm sorry about tonight," he said finally. "I shouldn't have let her come here again." Lily didn't look at him. Her fingers traced circles on the rabbit's worn ear. "You don't have to talk to me," Damien continued, the way he always did, though every night he hoped this would be the night she finally would. I just want you to know, I heard you. Even without words. I saw how scared you looked, and I'm sorry I didn't get there faster. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Lily's small hand reached out and found his sleeve, gripping the fabric the way she used to grip her mother's hand when she was a toddler learning to walk. It wasn't a word. It wasn't a sentence. But it was something, and Damien had learned over the past year to treasure every small something he was given. He stayed until she fell asleep, her hand still curled around his sleeve, and then he carefully eased himself away, tucking the blanket around her shoulders, before turning off the lamp. He walked past Lily's door once more before heading downstairs, pausing to look through the small gap where it stood ajar. She was asleep now, curled around the rabbit, the moon lamp casting a soft glow across her face. A year ago, this room had been full of noise. She used to sing to herself while she played, made up little songs about dragons and pirates and princesses who saved themselves instead of waiting to be rescued. Caroline used to laugh from the hallway, listening, always careful not to interrupt the small concerts her daughter never knew she was giving. Now the room only held the sound of the rain against the window and Lily's soft, even breathing. Damien closed the door gently and continued down the hall, the weight of the silence following him, like it always did. Downstairs, his mother was waiting in his study, a glass of wine in her hand, her posture as composed as ever despite the late hour. "We need to talk about this seriously," Margaret said as he entered. "The Kingsley family will not be pleased. Vanessa was our best option. Her father owns half the coastline properties we've been trying to negotiate for." "I don't care about the coastline properties," Damien said, dropping into the chair across from his desk. "I care about my daughter." "And I don't?" Margaret's voice cracked, just slightly, the first genuine emotion she'd shown all evening. "I lost a daughter-in-law I loved, Damien. I have watched my granddaughter disappear into herself for over a year, and I have tried everything I know to help fix it. By parading potential wives in front of her like she's supposed to pick one for me? By trying to give her stability." Margaret set the wine glass down harder than she meant to. "A mother figure, routine, someone who can help her the way I don't know how to. I am not equipped for this, Damien. I never was. Your father handled the emotional matters in this family, and he's been gone even longer than Caroline." The mention of his late wife's name still landed like a blow, even after 14 months. Damien looked away, toward the window, toward the dark garden where Caroline used to read to Lily under the old oak tree every evening before dinner. "She used to talk so much," he said quietly. "Do you remember? She never stopped. She had 100 questions every single day, and now she can't even ask for a glass of water without pointing." "I remember," Margaret said, her voice softer now. "None of these women can fix that. They don't even try to understand her. They see a rich man's silent daughter, and they see a problem to manage, not a child to love." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "Then what do you suggest?" "Because I refuse to sit back and watch this family fall apart, while you refuse every option I bring to you." "I don't know yet," Damien admitted, "but I know it isn't another dinner with a woman who cares more about the company's holdings than my daughter's face when she walks into a room. Lily notices everything, Mother. She notices who kneels down to her level and who waits for her to come to them. She notices who talks over her head like she isn't there, and who actually waits, even in silence, for her to feel safe enough to respond. Not one of the women you've introduced has ever waited." "They are not used to children who don't respond," Margaret said. "Most people aren't." "Then most people aren't right for this family," Damien said simply. Margaret studied her son for a long moment, something shifting behind her carefully composed expression. She had built her entire life around control, around choosing the right people for the right roles, and for the first time in a long while, she looked unsure of herself. "I only want what's best for both of you," she said finally, quieter than before. "I don't always know how to show it." "I know," Damien said, and he meant it, even through his frustration. "But this isn't working, and we both know it." Before Damien could answer, a knock interrupted them. His assistant, Owen, stepped in, holding a folder against his chest. "Sorry to disturb you, sir," Dr. Ferris called. She wanted to speak with you about Lily's session this week, but said it could wait until morning if you're occupied. No, Damien said, standing. I'll call her now. He excused himself to his private office down the hall, dialing the number before he'd even sat down. Dr. Ferris, Lily's speech therapist, answered on the second ring. Mr. Calloway, I'm glad you called. I wanted to update you on something before our session tomorrow. Please, Damien said. Anything that might help. I've been reading about alternative approaches for selective mutism in children who've experienced trauma, Dr. Ferris said. Traditional therapy is important, but sometimes children respond better to informal, low-pressure environments. Somewhere they don't feel like they're being evaluated. What are you suggesting? There's a librarian in town, at the public library on Maple Street. Her name is Nora Whitfield. She runs a children's story hour, and I've heard remarkable things from other parents. She has a gift for reaching children who struggle to communicate. No pressure, no expectations, just books and patience. Damien frowned, turning the idea over in his mind. You want me to send my daughter to a public library story hour? I want you to consider bringing Miss Whitfield here, actually, privately. Perhaps a few afternoons a week, just to read with Lily. No therapy language, no clinical pressure. Sometimes healing happens outside the therapy room, Mr. Calloway, in places that don't feel like therapy at all. Damien was silent for a moment, thinking of the 12 women who had come and gone through his home, each one polished and impressive, and utterly incapable of reaching his daughter. A librarian felt like an unlikely answer. But nothing else had worked, and he had learned this past year that desperation made people open to unlikely answers. Send me her information, he said. I'll reach out myself. After he hung up, he sat alone in his office for a long while, staring at the framed photograph on his desk. Caroline, laughing, Lily on her hip, both of them squinting against the sun on a beach they'd visited 3 summers ago. He touched the edge of the frame gently, the way he did most nights. I don't know if this will work, he said quietly to no one, but I have to try something different. The next morning, he asked Owen to find contact information for Nora Whitfield. It took less than an hour. She wasn't hard to find. She had worked at the Maple Street Library for 6 years, ran the children's reading program every Tuesday and Thursday, and according to nearly every review Owen printed out, she was beloved by every child who walked through the doors. Damien read through the notes twice, studying the photograph attached to her staff profile. She wasn't what he expected. She didn't look like the polished, camera-ready women his mother kept introducing him to. She had a warm, open face, curly brown hair pulled back loosely, and a smile that looked entirely unposed, like whoever took the photo had simply caught her mid-laugh. He picked up the phone before he could talk himself out of it. It rang twice before a woman answered, slightly breathless, as though she'd rushed to grab it. Maple Street Library. This is Nora. Miss Whitfield, Damien said, straightening in his chair out of old habit, even though she couldn't see him. My name is Damien Calloway. I was given your name by my daughter's speech therapist, Dr. Ferris. I understand you have experience working with children who struggle to speak. There was a brief pause on the other end, the sound of papers shuffling. I do some work with kids who need extra patience. Yes. Is this about your daughter? It is. She's 6. She hasn't spoken since her mother passed away last year. He hesitated, unused to explaining his family's pain to a stranger over the phone. I was hoping you might consider coming to our home a few afternoons a week. To read with her. Nothing formal. Dr. Ferris thought it might help. Another pause, longer this time. I'll be honest, Mr. Calloway. I've never done private sessions like that before. My work is mostly with groups at the library. I understand if it's not something you're interested in, Damien said quickly. I can compensate you generously for your time, of course, more than fairly for the inconvenience of traveling out to the house. It's not about the money, Nora said, and something in her tone made him pause. I just want to make sure I'd actually be helpful, not just another stranger showing up expecting her to perform for me. The words struck him harder than he expected. It was exactly what his daughter had endured for the past 14 months, one polished stranger after another, expecting a performance she couldn't give. That's precisely what I don't want, he said. I don't want her to perform. I just want someone patient enough to let her be quiet for as long as she needs to be." There was a long silence, and then Nora's voice came back, softer. "All right. I can come by Tuesday afternoon, after my shift ends here. We can see how it goes. No pressure, no expectations. Just to meet her, and maybe read a book if she's comfortable." "Thank you," Damien said, and he meant it more than the words could carry. "Don't thank me yet," Nora said, and he could hear the small, wry smile in her voice. "I haven't done anything yet." After he hung up, Damien sat back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He didn't know what to expect from a small-town librarian walking into his enormous, silent house. He didn't know if she would last a single afternoon before deciding, like so many others, that his daughter was too complicated, too broken, too much work, for whatever she was being paid. But something about her voice on the phone, the way she'd pushed back gently instead of simply agreeing to whatever he offered, made him think, for the first time in over a year, that maybe this one would be different. Upstairs, Lily sat by her window, watching the rain begin to fall over the garden, her rabbit tucked under one arm. She didn't know yet that Tuesday would bring a stranger into her world. She didn't know that this particular stranger would not ask her to perform, would not expect a smile, or a hug, or a single spoken word. She only knew that the house felt too big, too quiet, too full of people who wanted something from her that she couldn't give. Downstairs, her father sat with a folder full of information about a woman he had never met, hoping, quietly and desperately, that this time might finally be different. He thought of the 12 faces that had come before, each one a variation of the same expectation, each one leaving with the same complaint about his daughter's strangeness, her silence, her refusal to fit into the neat picture they had imagined for themselves. He thought of his mother's tired eyes, of the company pressures she never fully explained to him, of the coastline deal that mattered so much to her and so little to him. None of it mattered tonight. Only the small folder in his hands mattered, and the fragile hope that a stranger with an unposed smile might succeed where 12 carefully chosen women had failed. He closed the folder and turned off the desk lamp, letting the study fall into darkness around him, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel something close to hope. The gate at the end of the driveway was taller than Nora Whitfield's entire apartment building, and for a moment, she sat in her car staring up at it, wondering if she'd typed the wrong address into her phone. She hadn't. The iron gates swung open slowly, as if they'd been expecting her, and she drove up a long stretch of road, lined with trees, so perfectly trimmed they looked fake. By the time the house came into view, she'd already decided this was a mistake. It wasn't a house. It was a monument, all pale stone and towering windows, with a fountain out front that probably cost more than she made in 5 years. She parked her old sedan beside a car she was fairly sure cost more than her college education, smoothed down her cardigan, and grabbed the canvas tote bag full of picture books from the passenger seat. Her hands were sweating. She wiped them on her skirt before she rang the bell. A butler answered, dressed so formally that Nora briefly wondered if she'd walked onto a movie set. "Miss Whitfield, Mr. Calloway is expecting you." She followed him through an entrance hall bigger than the entire children's section of the library, past a curved staircase, past paintings that looked like they belonged in a museum rather than a home, until they reached a study where Damien Calloway stood waiting. He was taller than she expected, and he looked tired in a way that photographs never captured, dark circles beneath sharp eyes, a tension in his shoulders that seemed permanent. He extended a hand, and she shook it, noting the firm, businesslike grip. "Miss Whitfield, thank you for coming." "Nora is fine," she said, glancing around the study, at the leather furniture, and the wall of framed photographs. "This is quite a house." "It's too big," Damien said, surprising her with the honesty. "Caroline, my late wife, always said we'd downsize once Lily started school. We never got around to it." Nora didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, which turned out to be the right choice, because Damien simply nodded, as if grateful she hadn't offered a hollow condolence. "Before you meet her," he said, "I want to be clear about something. Lily has met 12 women in the past year that my mother insisted on introducing into our lives. Each one arrived expecting a certain kind of interaction, and each one left disappointed when they didn't get it. I don't want you walking in with any expectations either. Nora set her tote bag down on a nearby chair. I'm not here to meet a potential stepdaughter, Mr. Calloway. I'm here to read books with a little girl. Those are very different things. Something in his expression shifted, a flicker of surprise, maybe relief. Damien is fine, he said, and you're right. I apologize if that sounded accusatory. It's been a strange year. I imagine it has, Nora said gently. He led her upstairs, past more paintings, more closed doors, until they reached a room with a small nameplate shaped like a moon. Inside, Lily sat on the floor surrounded by stuffed animals, arranging them in some private order that only made sense to her. Colette, the nanny, sat nearby and looked up with a soft smile when they entered. Lily, Damien said gently, this is Miss Whitfield. She's going to spend some time with you this afternoon, if that's all right. Lily's eyes flicked up, taking in the stranger in the doorway, then dropped back to her stuffed animals. She didn't run, didn't scream, didn't throw anything, which Nora would later learn was already a better reaction than most of the 12 women had received. Hi, Lily, Nora said, staying near the doorway rather than approaching. She crouched down, not to loom over the small girl, but that alone put her at an awkward angle, so she simply sat down cross-legged on the carpet, several feet away. I brought some books. I wasn't sure what you liked, so I brought a few different kinds. She unpacked her tote bag slowly, laying the books out on the carpet between them like she was setting a table. A book about a dragon who was afraid of fire. A book about a girl who collected buttons from every place she visited. A wordless picture book about a fox exploring a forest at night. Lily's eyes drifted toward the books, curious despite herself, though she didn't move closer. You don't have to pick one, Nora said, settling in like she had all the time in the world, because she did. I'll just read to myself if you'd rather keep playing. She picked up the wordless picture book, the one about the fox, and opened it to the first page. She narrated softly, describing what she saw in the illustrations rather than reading actual text, since there wasn't any. The fox is walking through the forest at night. Look at all the stars. I think he's looking for something, but I'm not sure what yet. She kept her eyes on the book, giving Lily space to watch without feeling watched herself. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw the small girl's stuffed animals slowly abandoned, one by one, as Lily inched closer across the carpet. By the time Nora reached the 5th page, Lily was sitting close enough to see the pictures clearly, though still a careful arm's length away. Do you think he found what he's looking for? Nora asked, not really expecting an answer, simply thinking out loud the way she always did during story time at the library. Lily didn't answer, but she pointed, one small finger tapping the corner of the page, at a tiny illustration of an owl hidden in the branches. Nora's heart nearly stopped. She kept her voice steady, casual, like this was nothing extraordinary, though inside, she felt like she'd just witnessed something enormous. You found the owl. Good eye. I almost missed him the first time I read this. Lily didn't smile. Not exactly, but something in her small shoulders relaxed, just slightly, and she stayed close for the rest of the story, occasionally pointing at hidden details Nora genuinely hadn't noticed before. By the doorway, unseen by either of them, Damien stood frozen, watching his daughter interact with a stranger for the first time in longer than he could remember, without flinching away or shutting down entirely. He thought back to the first heiress his mother had introduced, a woman named Clarissa, who had walked into Lily's room, wearing heels too tall for carpet, carrying a stuffed elephant she'd clearly bought that morning, without asking what Lily actually liked. Lily had backed into the corner of her room and stayed there for the entire visit, refusing even to look at the elephant. Clarissa had left insulted, telling Margaret over dinner that the child was clearly troubled beyond what she'd been told. Damien remembered sitting through that dinner in silence, fork frozen halfway to his mouth, wondering how anyone could call a grieving 6-year-old troubled simply for not performing gratitude on command. There had been others after Clarissa. A woman who tried to bribe Lily with expensive toys. A woman who spoke to her the way one might speak to a much younger child, her voice pitched high and sing-song in a way that made Lily flinch. A woman who ignored Lily almost entirely and spent the visit talking to Damien about upcoming social events, as though the child in the room was simply part of the furniture to be worked around. Each failure had chipped away at something in him, a slow erosion of hope that had started the day Caroline died and had never fully stopped. Watching Nora now, sitting patiently on the floor without expectation, without performance, without even trying particularly hard to win Lily over, Damien felt something shift in his chest that he hadn't felt in over a year. It wasn't relief exactly. It was closer to disbelief, the cautious kind that refused to fully trust what it was seeing. When the session ended an hour later, Nora packed her books back into her tote bag, careful not to make a big production of leaving. "I had a lot of fun today," she said to Lily, who was back among her stuffed animals but watching Nora with quiet, careful eyes. "Maybe I'll bring a different book next time. Would that be okay?" Lily didn't answer, but she picked up the wordless fox book from the small stack Nora had left behind and held it against her chest, the way she held her rabbit. "I think that's a yes," Colette said softly, smiling for the first time since Nora had arrived. Damien walked Nora back downstairs, quieter than before, clearly processing what he'd just witnessed. "She pointed at something in the book," he said once they reached the entrance hall. "I haven't seen her engage with anything like that in over a year." "It's a small thing," Nora said, though she felt the weight of it too. "But small things add up. I wouldn't get your hopes too high after one visit." "I appreciate the caution," Damien said. "But it's hard not to." They stood in the entrance hall for a moment, an awkward silence settling between them, neither quite sure how to end the conversation. "Same time Thursday?" Nora asked finally. "Please," Damien said. And Nora, "Thank you. Genuinely." "Don't thank me yet," she said, echoing the words from their phone call, and this time she let herself smile. "We've had one good afternoon. Let's see how the rest go." She left the mansion feeling strange, unsettled in a way she couldn't quite name. It wasn't the wealth, though the house had certainly overwhelmed her at first. It was the sadness underneath all that wealth, the way a little girl's silence seemed to echo through every enormous empty room, and the way her father's exhaustion seemed carved into his face like it had been there for years rather than months. She thought about the 12 women who had come before her, the ones who had apparently failed so completely that a librarian earning a modest salary had become the family's next hope. She wondered what they had done wrong, or perhaps what they simply hadn't understood. Nora had grown up without much money herself, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep their small apartment above a hardware store. She had learned early that the people who tried hardest to impress a room were rarely the ones who actually helped the people in it. Her mother had taught her that patience mattered more than polish, that sitting quietly beside someone in pain was worth more than any grand gesture meant to fix them quickly. It was a lesson she carried into every story hour she ever ran at the library, watching shy children slowly unfold over weeks and months, never rushing them toward a version of themselves they weren't ready to be yet. She wondered if that was the difference. The 12 women before her had likely walked into that mansion already picturing themselves as Lily's new mother, already imagining the wedding, the family portraits, the life that came with marrying into the Calloway name. Nora had walked in, only picturing an hour of quiet reading, with a child who needed someone patient. Maybe that was enough of a difference to matter. She merged onto the highway back toward town, passing the modest houses and small shops that made up the world she actually belonged to, worlds away from iron gates and marble floors, and found herself already looking forward to Thursday. 2 days later, she returned on Thursday afternoon, this time with a stack of books about animals who felt too big, or too different, or too quiet for the world around them. Lily was waiting for her this time, sitting by the window with her rabbit, watching the driveway. The moment Nora's car appeared, Lily slipped off the window seat and went to find Colette, tugging at her sleeve and pointing toward the stairs, the closest thing to a request the nanny had seen from her in months. When Nora arrived upstairs, Lily was already sitting on the carpet where they'd sat before, the fox book from her last visit resting in her lap, waiting. "You kept it out," Nora said, delighted. "Did you look at it again?" Lily nodded, a small, definite motion. It wasn't a word, but it was a nod, deliberate and clear, and Nora felt something warm bloom in her chest at the sight of it. She sat down across from Lily and pulled a new book from her bag, one about a bear who hibernated so long that the whole forest changed around him by the time he woke up. As she read, describing the pictures the way she had before, she noticed Lily watching her mouth move, studying the shapes of her words the way a much younger child might, like she was relearning something she'd once known instinctively. Halfway through the story, Margaret Calloway appeared in the doorway, drawn by curiosity. After hearing about the librarian from the household staff, she said nothing, simply observed, her expression unreadable as she watched her granddaughter sit closer to a stranger than she had to any of the previous women introduced into the house. Nora noticed her, but didn't acknowledge it directly, choosing instead to keep her focus on Lily, on the story, on the small, fragile progress unfolding between them. She had a feeling, even then, on only her second visit, that not everyone in this house would welcome her the way Damien and Lily had begun to. She was right, though she wouldn't fully understand how right, for another few weeks. For now, she simply finished the story, watched Lily point at 3 more hidden details in the illustrations, and left the mansion with a quiet, cautious hope she hadn't expected to feel when she first drove through those enormous iron gates. That evening, back in her small apartment above a bakery on Willow Street, Nora sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, going through the notes she always kept after working with a new child. She wrote down what Lily had responded to, the wordless book, the quiet narration, the space to approach on her own terms rather than being approached. She wrote down what hadn't worked, the one moment she'd asked a direct question, and watched Lily retreat slightly, curling her shoulders inward, the way children do when a question feels like a test they might fail. Her roommate, Priya, wandered into the kitchen and dropped into the chair across from her, stealing a sip of tea without asking. "So how was the mansion? Did you get lost in it? I heard some of those houses out that way have their own bowling alleys." "I didn't see a bowling alley," Nora said, smiling despite herself. "But I believe it. The place is enormous. Too big for 2 people, honestly." "And the dad?" Priya asked, raising an eyebrow. "Please tell me he's not one of those rich guys who looks like he stepped out of a magazine." "He looks tired," Nora said honestly. "Sad, mostly. He lost his wife last year, and his daughter hasn't spoken since. It's not really the kind of house where you notice how nice the furniture is, once you understand what's actually happening inside it." Priya's teasing expression softened. "That's rough. Poor kid." "She's sweet," Nora said, thinking of the small finger pointing at hidden owls and foxes. "She's just scared, I think. Scared of a lot of things, but especially scared of people expecting something from her that she can't give." "And you're not expecting anything?" "I'm expecting her to sit quietly and maybe look at a book with me," Nora said. "That's all. No pressure, no performance." Priya studied her for a moment. "You always were good with the quiet ones. Remember that kid at the library last year? The one who wouldn't come out from behind the bookshelf for the first month?" Nora smiled at the memory. "Desmond. He talks so much now, his mother says she misses the quiet. See? You've got a gift. Don't let some fancy house intimidate you out of using it." "It's not the house that intimidates me," Nora admitted, staring down into her tea. "It's the responsibility. Everyone in that family is pinning so much hope on a few afternoons a week with me. What if I can't actually help her? What if I'm just another disappointment, only a slower one than the others?" "You won't know until you try," Priya said simply. "And from what you just told me, it sounds like you're already doing better than you think." Nora didn't answer right away, turning her mug slowly between her hands. She thought of Lily's small nod when she'd asked if she'd looked at the book again, definite and clear despite the silence surrounding it. She thought of Damien's face in the doorway, caught between disbelief and something that looked dangerously close to hope. She thought of Margaret's unreadable expression, watching from the hallway with an intensity that made Nora's skin prickle, though she couldn't say exactly why. Whatever was happening in that house, she was already part of it now, whether she felt ready for the responsibility or not. And as strange and overwhelming as the mansion had felt walking through its gates for the first time, she found herself hoping, quietly, that Thursday would come quickly. "More," Lily whispered. The word was so soft that Nora almost missed it, barely more than breath shaped into sound, but it landed in the quiet room like a thunderclap. Nora froze mid-page, her heart pounding, terrified that if she reacted too strongly, the moment would shatter and vanish before she could hold on to it. "You want me to keep reading?" she asked carefully, keeping her voice as light and ordinary as she could manage, as though 6-year-old girls whispered their first words in over a year to her every single day. Lily nodded, then, so quietly Nora almost doubted her own ears, whispered it again. More. Nora turned the page and kept reading, her hands trembling slightly, her mind racing even as she kept her voice calm and steady. This was the 4th week of visits. She'd started to notice small changes building on top of each other, nods becoming more frequent, pointing becoming more animated, Lily sitting closer each time, until she was practically leaning against Nora's shoulder during stories. But this was different. This was a word, an actual word, spoken out loud after more than a year of silence. When the session ended that afternoon, Nora didn't say anything to Damien right away. She wanted to be sure it hadn't been a fluke, a single accidental sound that wouldn't be repeated. But 2 days later, on Saturday, when Lily tugged on her sleeve to redirect her toward a different book on the shelf, she whispered again, this time 2 words. Not that one. Nora's breath caught. She glanced toward the doorway, where Colette stood folding laundry nearby, close enough to have heard. The nanny's hands had stopped moving entirely, her eyes wide with disbelief. Okay, Nora said softly, setting the rejected book aside. Which one then? Lily pointed to the bear book from 2 weeks earlier, the one about hibernation, and Nora reached for it without comment, though her chest felt like it might burst from the effort of staying calm. Word spread through the household quickly after that. By dinner, Damien had heard from Colette, who could barely get through the story without her voice shaking with emotion. He excused himself from his evening call immediately and went straight to Lily's room, where he found his daughter sitting on the floor with the bear book open in her lap, tracing the illustrations with one careful finger. Lily, he said, kneeling down slowly, the way he always did, careful not to move too fast. Colette told me something wonderful happened today. Lily looked up at him, and for a long moment, nothing happened. He didn't push. He simply waited, the way Nora had taught him without ever explicitly teaching him anything, simply by demonstrating it week after week. Bear, Lily said finally, pointing at the page. It wasn't a sentence. It wasn't even really a response to what he'd said. But it was a word, spoken directly to him, the first word she had said to her father since the night Caroline died, and Damien felt something inside his chest crack open. 13 months of grief and fear and helplessness rushing out all at once. He didn't cry in front of her. He'd learned that much over the past year, that his own emotions, however justified, could overwhelm her fragile progress if he wasn't careful. Instead, he smiled, resting a hand gently on the book beside hers. Bear, he agreed. That's right. He's sleeping for a very long time, isn't he? Lily nodded. Then, so quietly he had to lean in to hear it, whispered, wakes up. He does wake up, Damien said, his voice thick with emotion he was fighting hard to keep contained. Everything changes while he's sleeping, but he still wakes up. That night, once Lily was asleep, Damien went downstairs and found himself standing in the kitchen doorway of the guest cottage, where Nora had been given a small office space for her sessions, though she'd already left for the day. He stood there for a long moment, staring at nothing, overwhelmed by a gratitude he didn't fully know how to express. He called her that evening instead, something he hadn't done outside of scheduling their sessions. I heard about today, he said when she answered. Colette told me. And then Lily said a word to me directly, for the first time since Caroline passed. There was a pause on the line, and when Nora spoke, her voice was thick too. I wasn't sure if I should tell you myself, or let it happen naturally. I didn't want to make it feel like a performance for you, something she had to repeat on command. You made the right choice, Damien said. I don't know how to thank you for this. You don't have to thank me, Nora said, echoing words he'd heard from her before, though this time neither of them believed them fully. She did this herself. I just sat with her while she found her way there. That's not nothing, Damien said quietly. That's everything, actually. He stayed a while longer, watching her sleep, thinking about how far she'd come from the terrified child who had thrown a shoe at Vanessa Kingsley just weeks earlier. He thought of Caroline, of how she would have handled this transition, how she always seemed to know exactly what Lily needed before Lily herself understood it. He liked to imagine that Caroline would have approved of Nora, would have recognized in her the same patient, unhurried warmth that had defined her own approach to motherhood. It was a comforting thought, even if he couldn't be certain it was true. Over the following weeks, Lily's whispered words became slightly more frequent, though still rare, still fragile, still reserved almost entirely for Nora and, gradually, for Damien. She remained silent around everyone else, around Colette, around the household staff, around her grandmother, though even Margaret had started to notice the shift in the girl's posture, the way she no longer flinched quite as visibly when someone entered a room. Margaret's reaction to the progress was complicated, layered with things she didn't fully examine herself. She was relieved, genuinely relieved, to see her granddaughter improving after over a year of watching her disappear further into herself. But she was also unsettled by the source of that improvement, by the fact that a modest librarian with no social standing had succeeded where 12 carefully selected women of appropriate background had failed entirely. During those weeks, something else began shifting quietly alongside Lily's progress, something neither Damien nor Nora acknowledged directly, though both felt it building in the small moments between sessions. He began finding reasons to be present when she arrived, lingering in the entrance hall rather than remaining in his study, offering her coffee before she started with Lily, walking her to her car afterward instead of leaving that task to the staff. She began arriving a few minutes early, taking her time as she packed away her books at the end of each visit, lingering in conversations with him about Lily's progress that stretched longer than they needed to. Neither of them named it. Damien was keenly aware of how complicated it would be, given his position, given his daughter's fragile progress, given the very real possibility that any misstep between him and Nora could undo months of careful, hard-won trust. Nora was aware of it too, aware of the gap between their worlds, the mansion and the modest apartment above the bakery, the household staff and the library shelves. She reorganized herself every week. But awareness did not stop the small smile that crossed her face each time his name appeared on her phone, or the way he found himself thinking about her at odd hours, wondering what she was doing, whether she'd had dinner yet, whether she was thinking of him at all. One afternoon, after a session that had run long because Lily insisted on reading the Bear book 3 times in a row, Nora found Damien waiting for her by her car, leaning against the door with his hands in his pockets, looking younger than she'd ever seen him. "I wanted to say thank you properly," he said. "Not just for Lily, for all of it. I don't think I've laughed this much in over a year, and it's because of the stories you tell about the library, about the kids you work with. You bring something into this house that's been missing for a long time." Nora felt her cheeks warm. "I'm just doing my job, Damien." "I don't think that's entirely true anymore," he said, holding her gaze a moment longer than professional courtesy required, "but I understand if it's easier to call it that." She didn't have a response ready, and for a long moment, they simply stood there, the tension between them charged with everything neither of them had said aloud. Then Lily's voice, faint but clear, called from an upstairs window, asking when Nora would come back, and the moment dissolved into laughter, into ordinary logistics about Thursday's schedule, into the safe distance both of them still needed, for now. It came to a head on a Sunday evening, at a family dinner Margaret had insisted upon, ostensibly to discuss upcoming business matters, but really, Damien suspected, to remind everyone of the family's expectations. He'd invited Nora, at Lily's insistence, communicated through a series of gestures and a single whispered request that had taken him several minutes to understand. Lily wanted Nora there. It was the first request she'd made in over a year, and Damien would not have denied it for anything. Nora arrived in a simple green dress, nothing extravagant, and immediately felt the weight of the room's judgment the moment she walked through the door. Margaret's eyes swept over her with obvious appraisal, taking in every detail, from her shoes to the shape of her arms, in a way that made Nora's skin crawl even before a single word was spoken. Dinner started politely enough, though the tension in the room was palpable. Lily sat between Nora and Damien, uncharacteristically animated for a family gathering, occasionally whispering short observations to Nora that made the girl almost smile, something none of the staff had seen in over a year. It was during dessert that Margaret finally struck. "I have to say, Miss Whitfield," she said, setting down her wine glass with deliberate precision, "I'm impressed by whatever it is you've done with Lily. Truly, But I do wonder if you understand the position you're in here. I'm not sure I follow, Nora said carefully, feeling Damien tense beside her. This family has certain expectations, Margaret continued, her voice pleasant but sharp underneath, like silk wrapped around a blade. Certain standards, when it comes to who is seen with us publicly, who represents this household. I'm sure you understand that a children's librarian, however talented with troubled children, isn't quite suited for that kind of role. Mother, Damien said sharply, but Margaret continued as though she hadn't heard him. I only say this out of concern for you, dear, Margaret said to Nora, her tone dripping with false warmth. This family attracts a great deal of attention. Photographers, journalists, people who scrutinize every detail. I would hate for you to be humiliated by comparisons you can't win. Vanessa Kingsley, for instance, spent years preparing for a life like this. You've spent, what, 6 years reading picture books to strangers' children? The table fell silent. Even the household staff serving dessert paused, uncertain whether to continue. Nora felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady, refusing to give Margaret the reaction she was clearly hoping for. I'm not here to compete with Vanessa Kingsley, Mrs. Calloway. I'm here because your granddaughter asked me to be, and because your son hired me to help her, which I have done, whether or not it fits neatly into whatever standards you're describing. How admirable, Margaret said coolly. But standards exist for a reason. This family did not build what it has by ignoring appearances. Enough, Damien said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Nora is here because my daughter wanted her here, and because she has done more for Lily in 1 month than 12 carefully selected women did in over a year combined. If that offends your standards, Mother, that is a problem with the standards, not with her. Margaret's lips tightened, but she said nothing further, retreating instead into a cold, brittle silence for the remainder of the meal. Beside Damien, Lily had gone very still during the exchange, her small hand finding Nora's under the table and gripping it tightly. Nora squeezed back gently, offering what reassurance she could without drawing further attention. Later that night, after Nora had gone home and Lily had been put to bed, Damien found his mother alone in the drawing room, a fresh glass of wine in her hand. That was unnecessary, he said, standing in the doorway. Was it? Margaret asked, not looking up. Someone needed to say it. You've clearly grown attached to this woman, Damien, and I understand why, given what she's accomplished with Lily. But attachment and appropriateness are not the same thing. Appropriateness, Damien repeated, the word tasting bitter. You mean money. You mean status. You mean whether the tabloids will approve of her, the way they approved of Caroline's family name. I mean survival, Margaret said, finally looking up at him, her eyes tired in a way he rarely saw. This company, this family, exists in a world that judges harshly, Damien. I have spent my entire life protecting this family from that judgment, and I am not willing to watch you throw that protection away over feelings that may not last. These aren't feelings that may not last, Damien said quietly, surprising himself with the certainty in his own voice. This is my daughter speaking again, for the first time in over a year. Whatever this becomes between me and Nora, that alone is worth more than every standard you've ever tried to hold this family to. He left the room before she could respond, climbing the stairs toward his daughter's room out of habit, though she was already asleep. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her small chest rise and fall, the bare book still resting on her nightstand where she'd left it. Whatever his mother believed about standards and appropriateness, he knew, standing there in the quiet, that something had shifted permanently in this house, something he was no longer willing to undo for anyone's comfort but his daughter's. Across town, Nora sat on her small balcony above the bakery, the smell of the next morning's bread already beginning to drift up through the floorboards, and replayed the dinner in her mind. She hadn't expected Margaret's words to sting as much as they did, though she'd braced herself for something like it the moment she'd accepted the invitation. She had spent her whole life being underestimated, first as a girl from a family with no money, then as a young woman whose body never matched the narrow shapes magazines told her mattered, then as a librarian whose work was often dismissed as simple, as though patience and empathy were skills anyone could pick up without effort. She had built a quiet kind of armor against those judgments over the years, but sitting at that long dinner table, surrounded by crystal and candlelight, and a woman who clearly believed she didn't belong there, the armor had felt thinner than usual. What surprised her most was not Margaret's cruelty, which she'd half expected, but Damien's response to it. She thought of the way his voice had cut through the tension, certain and unwavering, defending her without hesitation in front of his own mother. Nobody had defended her like that in a long time, not since her own mother passed years earlier, and the memory of it left her feeling something dangerously close to hope, the same fragile, cautious hope she'd been trying to hold at arm's length since her very first visit to that enormous house. She thought of Lily's small hand gripping hers under the table, seeking reassurance in a room full of adults who didn't understand her, and felt a fierce, protective warmth rise in her chest. Whatever complications existed between her world and the Calloway family's world, whatever Margaret believed about standards and appropriateness, Nora found she cared less and less about winning the older woman's approval, and more about the two people in that house who had, without either of them fully realizing it, become the center of her days. Her phone buzzed on the small table beside her, a message from Damien, sent late, past the hour most professional correspondence would allow. It simply read that Lily had asked for the bear book again before falling asleep, and that she'd said Nora's name twice while flipping through the pages. Nora read it 3 times before setting the phone down, smiling into the darkness of her small balcony, feeling, for the first time in a long while, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, however complicated the road ahead might become. Either the Kingsley engagement moves forward within the month, or the Calloway board will vote to remove you as controlling partner. Damien stared at his mother across the desk in the family's downtown office, certain for a moment that he'd misheard her. "You're threatening my position at the company over who I choose to spend time with." "I'm informing you of a reality," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the tremor Damien could see in her hands. "Your father structured the board agreements before he died to protect this family from exactly this kind of instability. If the board determines that your personal choices are damaging the company's public image or its key partnerships, they have grounds to intervene. The Kingsley family controls access to every coastline development permit in 3 counties, Damien. Losing that relationship over a librarian would be seen as reckless, not romantic." "So, this was never about Lily," Damien said quietly. "It was always about Kingsley's permits." "It's about both," Margaret said. "It has always been about both. I never wanted anything but the best for that little girl, and I have watched Nora Whitfield help her more than I imagined possible. But I cannot pretend that doesn't also come with consequences you seem unwilling to consider." Damien sat back in his chair, his mind racing through the implications. The board, made up largely of men and women loyal to his father's legacy, and, by extension, to Margaret's judgment, held real power over major company decisions. He had never tested that power directly, had never needed to, secure in the assumption that his personal life remained separate from his professional obligations. He realized now, sitting across from his mother's carefully composed expression, how naive that assumption had been. "Give me time," he said finally. "I won't be pushed into an engagement with Vanessa Kingsley to save a business deal." "You have until the gala next month," Margaret said. "The Kingsleys will be there. So will half the board. If you cannot present a suitable partner by then, or at minimum, demonstrate that your priorities align with this family's interests, I cannot promise what the board will decide." He left the office that afternoon feeling like the walls of his own life were closing in around him, the fragile happiness of the past several weeks suddenly under threat from a direction he hadn't fully anticipated. He drove home instead of returning calls, needing the quiet of the long roads to think. He thought about his father, a man he'd respected deeply, but who had never once, in Damien's memory, allowed personal feeling to interfere with business judgment. His father had built the coastline partnerships with the Kingsleys over decades, treating every relationship, professional or otherwise, as a piece on a larger board to be managed carefully. Damien had spent years believing that was simply what it meant to lead a family like this, to place duty above desire at every turn. It was only in the past year, watching his daughter waste away in silence while a parade of appropriate women failed to reach her, that he'd begun to question whether his father's model of leadership had cost their family more than it had ever protected. He pulled the car over on a quiet stretch of road overlooking the water, cutting the engine, letting the silence settle around him. Somewhere out past the horizon sat the coastline properties his mother was so desperate to secure through the Kingsley alliance, acres of undeveloped land that would, if the deal went through, add substantially to the family's already considerable wealth. He tried to imagine what his life would look like in 10 years if he chose that path, married to Vanessa, or someone like her. Lily, raised by nannies and tutors, while both parents attended to business obligations that never seemed to end. He tried to imagine Lily's face in that version of the future, and found he couldn't picture her smiling in it at all. He started the car again and drove the rest of the way home in silence, the decision already forming in his mind even before he fully admitted it to himself. At the house, Lily's progress had continued steadily. She spoke more now, still mostly to Nora and Damien, still rarely above a whisper, but full sentences had begun emerging, small observations about her books, occasional questions about the world around her. Colette reported that Lily had started humming to herself again while she played, faint and hesitant, but unmistakably present, the first music the house had heard from her in over a year. That evening, during Nora's session, Lily was in the middle of describing, in halting whispered fragments, a dream she'd had about a garden full of talking flowers, when Colette appeared in the doorway, her expression troubled. "Mr. Calloway asked to see you before you leave, Miss Whitfield," she said, in his study. Nora exchanged a glance with Lily, who had gone quiet again, sensing the shift in the room's energy the way children often did. "I'll be right back," Nora promised, and Lily nodded, though her small hands twisted anxiously in her lap. In the study, Damien looked worse than she'd seen him in weeks. The exhaustion from the afternoon's confrontation with his mother etched clearly into his face. "What's wrong?" Nora asked immediately. He hesitated, unsure how much to share, unwilling to burden her with the full weight of the board's threat, but equally unwilling to lie to her. "My mother is pushing hard for me to pursue an engagement with Vanessa Kingsley again. There are business pressures involved that I won't bore you with, but it's become more serious than I expected." Nora felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Are you considering it?" "No," Damien said firmly, "but I need you to know it's happening, because it may affect how much longer you're able to work here, depending on how my mother chooses to handle things." "Are you saying I might lose this position?" Nora asked, her voice tightening. "I don't know," Damien admitted. "I'm saying my mother has more influence than I realized, and I don't yet know how far she's willing to go to protect the company's interests." Nora left that evening deeply unsettled, the warmth of the afternoon session with Lily overshadowed by the weight of what Damien had told her. She drove home replaying the conversation, wondering if she should start preparing herself, and Lily, for the possibility that this arrangement might end regardless of how much progress they'd made together. She didn't have to wonder long. 2 days later, while restocking the library's children's section, she received a call from an unknown number. It was Owen, Damien's assistant, his voice apologetic and rushed. "Miss Whitfield, I'm sorry to bother you at work. Mrs. Calloway has asked that your sessions be paused, effective immediately, pending a review of the arrangement. She didn't specify how long the review would take." Nora's hands went numb around the phone. "Does Mr. Calloway know about this?" "I believe Mrs. Calloway made the decision while he was in a meeting he couldn't step out of," Owen said carefully, his tone suggesting he understood exactly how inappropriate the timing was. "I wanted to let you know as soon as possible, out of courtesy." Nora thanked him mechanically and hung up, standing frozen among the shelves of picture books, her mind racing toward Lily, toward the small girl who had finally started speaking again, who had no way of understanding why the one person outside her family who made her feel safe had suddenly disappeared without warning. At the mansion, Lily discovered the news far too directly. She had been waiting by the window that afternoon, watching for Nora's car the way she always did on session days, when Colette gently explained that Nora wouldn't be coming today, or perhaps for a while. The silence that followed was worse than any tantrum could have been. Lily didn't scream or cry immediately. She simply went still, the way she'd been the night Vanessa Kingsley left the house months earlier, her small body curling inward as though trying to disappear. Then, hours later, alone in her room, the sobbing started, deep and wrenching. the sound of a child who had only just learned to trust something and watched it vanish without explanation. Damien arrived home to find his daughter inconsolable, Colette sitting helplessly beside her bed, unable to offer any comfort that reached her. He sat down immediately, pulling Lily into his arms despite her initial resistance, holding her through the worst of it. "Where is she?" Lily managed between sobs, the first full sentence she had spoken to anyone but Nora in over a year, torn from her by grief rather than calm. "Where did she go?" "She didn't leave because she wanted to," Damien said, his own voice breaking as he held his daughter. "I promise you, sweetheart, she didn't want to leave." He got the full story from Owen within the hour, his fury building with every detail. His mother had acted without his knowledge, without his consent, using her considerable influence over the household staff to end Nora's sessions the moment he was unreachable. He found Margaret in the drawing room, exactly where he'd found her weeks earlier during their last confrontation, and this time, he didn't bother softening his approach. "You had no right," he said, his voice shaking with barely controlled anger. "You had no right to make that decision, and you certainly had no right to do it behind my back while I was in a meeting." "I did what was necessary," Margaret said, though for the first time, her composure seemed genuinely strained. "The board meets in 3 weeks, Damien. I needed to show them movement, some sign that priorities were shifting back toward stability." "Do you hear yourself?" Damien asked. "Your granddaughter is upstairs sobbing because the one person who helped her find her voice again disappeared without warning, and you're worried about optics for a board meeting." Margaret's expression flickered, something like genuine regret passing briefly across her features, before her composure reasserted itself. "I love that girl more than you know, Damien, but I have spent my entire life protecting this family's future, and I cannot simply abandon that responsibility because it's become inconvenient." "Then I'll protect her myself," Damien said, "without you, if necessary." He left the drawing room and went straight to his study, calling Nora immediately, though it was well past a reasonable hour to be calling anyone. She answered on the first ring, as though she'd been waiting by the phone. "I heard what happened," she said, before he could speak. "Owen called me. I'm so sorry, Damien. I don't know what I could have done differently to prevent this." "You didn't do anything wrong," Damien said. "This is entirely my mother's doing, and I'm fixing it tonight. I need you to come back, Nora. Lily needs you, and honestly, I need you too." "I should have said that weeks ago, instead of letting things stay unspoken between us." There was a long pause on the line. "Damien, I've been thinking about this too, more than I probably should have, but I don't think I can keep walking into a house where I'm constantly one board meeting away from being erased. It isn't fair to Lily, and it isn't fair to me either. Give me a chance to fix this properly," Damien said. "Not just patch it over for another few weeks. I mean actually fix it, so this never happens again." Nora was quiet for a long moment. "I need to think, Damien, about all of it. Lily, you, everything. I care about both of you more than I probably should, given how complicated this has become, and I don't know how to protect myself from getting hurt if I keep saying yes to every request, without any real security in return." She hung up gently, leaving Damien standing alone in his study, the weight of everything he stood to lose, settling over him more heavily than the board's threats ever had. The next morning, he made his decision. He called an emergency meeting with the board's senior members, choosing to face the confrontation directly, rather than let his mother continue managing it from the shadows. He spent the morning reviewing the company's founding agreements, line by line, searching for the exact clauses his mother had referenced, determined to understand precisely how much power the board actually held over decisions that belonged, by every reasonable measure, to him alone. He also called a moving company, quietly, without telling anyone in the house, and began making arrangements of his own, determined that whatever happened with the company, he would not lose the 2 people who had finally brought life back into his home. He did not yet know exactly what those arrangements would look like, only that he needed to be ready to act the moment clarity arrived, for Lily's sake as much as his own. Across town, Nora sat in her apartment, a half-packed suitcase open on her bed, uncertain whether she was preparing to leave the arrangement entirely or simply preparing herself for whatever came next. Priya found her staring blankly at the folded clothes, concern etched across her face. "You don't actually want to leave," Priya said gently, sitting down beside her. "I can see it all over your face. You're just scared." "I have every reason to be scared," Nora said. "That family has more power than I know how to navigate, and I don't want Lily caught in the middle of a war I can't win." "Lily's already in the middle of it," Priya pointed out. "The only question is whether you're standing beside her when it's over, or watching from a distance because you were too afraid to stay." Nora didn't answer, staring instead at the suitcase, at the life she'd built carefully and modestly over years of steady, unremarkable choices, now suddenly tangled with a world of gates and boards and threats she'd never asked to be part of. She thought of Lily's small hand under the dinner table, of Damien's voice cutting through his mother's cruelty without hesitation, of the bear book still sitting on a nightstand in a room she might never see again. She closed the suitcase without finishing the packing, unable to decide, and sat on the edge of her bed long into the night, waiting for a clarity that refused to come easily. Sleep didn't come easily either. She kept replaying moments from the past several weeks, small fragments that seemed insignificant at the time, but now felt heavier in hindsight. Lily's whispered word, spoken for the first time in over a year, directed at her rather than anyone else in that enormous house. Damien's voice at the dinner table, unwavering as he defended her against his own mother's cruelty. The quiet ease that had settled between the three of them during their sessions, a kind of comfort she hadn't expected to find in a house so far removed from anything she'd known growing up. She thought, too, about her own mother, who had worked herself thin trying to give Nora a stable, loving childhood despite having so little to offer materially. Her mother had always told her that love wasn't about what people could give each other, but about who showed up, again and again, especially when showing up was difficult. Nora had spent years believing that lesson applied mostly to friendships, to the quiet, steady relationships she'd built with the children at the library who trusted her, precisely because she never asked for anything in return. She hadn't considered, until this moment, sitting alone with a half-packed suitcase, that the same lesson might apply to whatever was growing between her and Damien, and by extension, between her and Lily. Walking away now would be the safer choice, certainly. It would spare her the uncertainty of loving people whose world operated by rules she barely understood, whose family politics could apparently upend her life with a single phone call from an assistant. But safety had never been the thing she valued most, not in her work, not in her relationships, not in the quiet, unglamorous choices that had shaped her life so far. She valued showing up, the way her mother had taught her, the way she'd shown up for Desmond behind the bookshelf, the way she'd shown up for Lily on the floor of her bedroom with a wordless book about a fox. By the time the first gray light of morning crept through her window, she still hadn't finished packing, and she still hadn't made a final decision. But something in her had shifted overnight, a quiet resolve settling into place beneath the fear. Whatever happened next, she would not be the one who left without a fight, not this time. Not for people who had already shown her, in 100 small ways, exactly how much they needed her to stay. The knock on Nora's apartment door came at 7 in the morning, sharp and urgent, pulling her out of a restless half-sleep she'd only fallen into an hour earlier. She opened it still in yesterday's clothes, her hair a mess, and found Damien standing in the hallway, breathing hard as though he'd run up the stairs rather than taken the elevator. "I know it's early," he said. "I know I should have called first, but I couldn't wait any longer, and I was afraid if I didn't come now, you'd already have your mind made up by the time I found the words." Nora stepped back to let him in, too stunned to say anything immediately. He looked disheveled in a way she'd never seen him before, his tie loosened, his hair unkempt, dark circles beneath his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept at all. "Damien, what's going on?" "I met with the board this morning," he said, pacing a few steps into her small living room, before turning back to face her. "Before dawn, actually. I called an emergency session and told them exactly what I thought of using my daughter's well-being as leverage in a business negotiation. I told them the Kingsley deal could proceed, or not proceed entirely on its own merits, without being tied to who I choose to love." Nora's breath caught at the word, though he continued before she could respond. "I also told my mother, in front of the board, that if she ever again made a unilateral decision about my daughter's care without my consent, I would remove her from any operational authority in this company permanently." She wasn't pleased. But she didn't argue, not with the entire board watching. "Damien," Nora said again, softer this time. "You didn't have to do all of that." "Yes, I did," he said simply. "Because none of it mattered more than you and Lily. It took me far too long to say that out loud, and I'm not making that mistake again." He crossed the small room, stopping close enough that she could see the exhaustion and determination fighting for space in his expression. "I'm not asking you to walk back into a house full of politics and threats without any protection," he said. "I've already spoken to my lawyers about drawing up a formal agreement, guaranteeing your position, your compensation, your say in how Lily's care is handled, completely separate from anything my mother or the board could interfere with in the future. But more than that, I'm asking you to stay because Lily needs you, and because I need you too, in ways that go far beyond whatever arrangement we started with months ago." Nora felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, the exhaustion of the sleepless night colliding with the relief flooding through her chest. "I was scared," she admitted. "Not of your mother exactly, though she certainly didn't help. I was scared of caring this much about people who could lose interest, or get pulled back into a world I don't fully belong to." "You belong to whatever world you choose to be part of," Damien said. "And I would very much like that world to include us, if you're willing." Nora didn't answer with words. She stepped forward instead, closing the distance between them, and for the first time since they'd met, allowed herself to lean into the space they'd both been carefully avoiding for weeks. Damien wrapped his arms around her, holding on like he'd been waiting months for permission to do exactly that. They stayed like that for a long moment, the early morning light filtering through her small kitchen window, the sounds of the bakery below beginning its daily rhythm of ovens and mixers. "There's something else," Damien said eventually, pulling back just enough to look at her properly. "The gala my mother mentioned. The one where she wanted me to announce an engagement with Vanessa Kingsley. It's in 2 weeks. I'd like you to come with me, if you're comfortable with it. Not hidden, not explained away as staff or an employee, as exactly what you are to me." Nora hesitated, old fears resurfacing briefly. "Your mother will be there. So will Vanessa probably. And half the board." "I know," Damien said. "And I want them all to understand, clearly, that this isn't a phase or a rebellion or a temporary arrangement. I want them to see who actually helped my daughter find her voice again, and who I intend to build a life with, if she'll have me." Nora laughed softly, the sound surprising her after such a heavy night. "That's a lot to put on one gala." "I've never been particularly good at subtlety," Damien admitted, smiling for what felt like the first time in days. She agreed, though the decision did not come without its own quiet fears. That night, after Damien left, she sat with Priya at their small kitchen table, turning the invitation over in her mind out loud. "You're really going to walk into that gala on his arm," Priya said, half question, half disbelief. "In front of the Kingsleys, in front of the board, in front of everyone who thinks a woman like you doesn't belong in a room like that." "I know how it sounds," Nora admitted. "Reckless, maybe. But I've spent my whole life shrinking myself to fit into spaces that weren't built for people like me. I'm tired of it. If Damien is willing to stand beside me in front of all of them, I think I owe it to both of us to actually show up." Priya reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "For what it's worth, I think you're the bravest person I know. Not because you're marching into some fancy party. Because you let yourself hope again, after everything that happened with your mother, after every relationship that fizzled out because someone couldn't handle loving a woman who takes up space unapologetically. This is different. I can see it on your face." Nora managed a small, watery smile. "I'm terrified." "Good," Priya said. "That means it matters." Over the following 2 weeks, life at the mansion settled into something steadier than it had been in months. Nora resumed her sessions with Lily, who cried with relief the moment she saw her again, clutching the bare book tightly, as though afraid it might disappear along with everything else. Margaret remained distant but noticeably restrained, no longer attempting to interfere directly, though the tension between her and Damien remained palpable whenever they crossed paths. The night of the gala arrived with a nervous energy that seemed to fill the entire house. Nora had never attended an event like this before, a room full of the city's wealthiest families, journalists stationed at the entrance, photographers ready to capture every arrival. She wore a deep blue dress she'd chosen carefully, not because it matched anyone else's expectations, but because it made her feel like herself, comfortable and confident in her own shape, despite the room full of women who had spent their whole lives being told what a body was supposed to look like to belong in places like this. Damien met her at the entrance, offering his arm, and together they walked into the ballroom, drawing exactly the kind of attention he'd anticipated. Whispers followed them across the room, curious glances, a few outright stares. Nora kept her chin up, refusing to shrink beneath the scrutiny, reminding herself of everything her mother had taught her about showing up despite fear. Vanessa found them within the first 20 minutes, her expression tight with barely concealed irritation. "I heard rumors," she said, addressing Damien directly while sweeping a dismissive glance over Nora, "but I didn't believe them until now." "Believe them?" Damien said simply, his hand steady around Nora's. "Your mother led me to believe this arrangement was temporary," Vanessa said. "A phase," she called it, "something that would pass once you came to your senses." "My mother was mistaken," Damien said, his voice carrying enough that several nearby guests turned to listen. "Nora is not a phase. She's the reason my daughter speaks again, the reason this family has any warmth left in it at all, and I intend to spend the rest of my life proving to her exactly how much that matters to me." The room around them had gone noticeably quieter, conversations pausing as guests strained to follow the exchange. Margaret appeared at the edge of the gathering crowd, her expression unreadable, though Nora noticed her hands tightening around her wine glass. Vanessa's composure cracked slightly under the weight of the public rejection. "You're choosing a librarian over everything this family has built." "I'm choosing my daughter's happiness," Damien corrected, "and it turns out that happiness comes bundled with an extraordinary woman I very much intend to keep." Vanessa left shortly after, her exit far less dramatic than her arrival months earlier at the mansion, though no less final. The crowd slowly returned to its usual murmur, though Nora could feel dozens of eyes still tracking her movements throughout the room. Margaret approached later in the evening, finding Nora alone near the edge of the dance floor, while Damien spoke briefly with a business associate. Nora braced herself for another confrontation, but Margaret's expression, for once, held something closer to weariness than hostility. "I owe you an apology," Margaret said quietly, surprising Nora entirely. "Several, actually. I let my fear about this family's future cloud my judgment about what actually matters. Watching my granddaughter tonight, laughing with the caterer's daughter near the dessert table, speaking in full sentences for the first time in longer than I can properly remember, I understand now what I was too stubborn to see before." "Thank you," Nora said carefully, unsure how much trust to extend after everything that had happened. "I won't pretend our relationship will be simple," Margaret continued. "I have spent too many years building walls to tear them down overnight. But I am willing to try, for Lily's sake, and for Damien's." It wasn't a complete resolution, but it was something, a small crack of light in a relationship that had begun in cruelty and judgment. Nora accepted it for what it was, unwilling to demand more than Margaret seemed capable of offering that night. As the gala wound down and guests began filtering toward the exits, Owen approached Damien with a folder of urgent messages that had accumulated throughout the evening, mostly board members eager to discuss the fallout from his morning ultimatum. Damien waved them off for the first time in his professional life, telling Owen plainly that whatever the board needed to discuss could wait until Monday. Tonight belonged to his family, not to the company, a distinction he suspected his father had never once allowed himself to make. Driving home that night, Nora watched the city lights blur past the window, replaying the evening's events with a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief. She had walked into that ballroom bracing for humiliation, and walked out having witnessed Damien defend her publicly, having received something resembling an apology from the woman who'd tried hardest to push her away, and having felt, for the first time in her adult life, entirely certain that she belonged exactly where she stood. The following months brought their own quiet challenges, adjusting to a life that blended two worlds so different from each other that friction was inevitable. Nora kept her position at the library, refusing to give up the work that had shaped her identity long before she'd ever heard the name Calloway, though she scaled back her hours to accommodate the growing role she played in Lily's life. Damien, in turn, began delegating more company responsibilities to trusted executives, determined not to repeat the pattern of distance and obligation that had defined his own father's relationship with his family. Margaret's transformation remained gradual and imperfect, marked by occasional lapses into old habits, sharp comments about propriety that she caught herself making, and, more often than not, corrected before they could fully land. But she began joining Sunday dinners without complaint, began asking Lily about her books rather than her manners, began, slowly, to understand that the family she'd spent her life protecting had needed warmth far more than it had ever needed status. Weeks later, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, Nora sat in the garden behind the mansion, reading with Lily beneath the old oak tree Caroline had once favored for the same purpose. Lily's voice had grown steadier over the following months, still occasionally quiet, still occasionally hesitant, but unmistakably present in a way that had once felt impossible. Damien joined them partway through the story, settling onto the blanket beside Nora, watching his daughter narrate her favorite parts of the book from memory, embellishing details the way children often did, once they felt safe enough to claim ownership over the stories they loved. When the book ended, Lily closed it carefully and climbed into Nora's lap, resting her head against her shoulder the way she'd started doing in recent weeks, a gesture of trust that still caught Nora off guard with its tenderness every time it happened. "Nora," Lily said softly, her small fingers tracing the cover of the book. "Yes, sweetheart?" Lily hesitated, glancing briefly at her father, who gave her an encouraging nod, having clearly anticipated whatever was coming. "Can I call you Mom?" Lily asked, her voice trembling slightly with the vulnerability of the question. "Not instead of my real mom, just also. Is that allowed?" Nora's throat tightened, tears rising before she could stop them. She pulled Lily closer, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "That's allowed," she whispered. "That's more than allowed. I would be honored." Damien reached over, taking Nora's free hand in his, threading their fingers together in the quiet warmth of the afternoon. Above them, sunlight filtered through the old oak tree's branches, the same tree where Caroline had once read to her daughter every evening, and for the first time in over a year, the garden felt full again instead of haunted by absence. Later that evening, after Lily had fallen asleep contentedly in her own bed, Damien led Nora out to the balcony overlooking the grounds, the same fountain visible below that had intimidated her so completely on her very first visit months earlier. "I know this has been a strange, complicated road," he said, turning to face her fully. 12 women came through that gate before you, each one chosen for reasons that had nothing to do with what actually mattered. You walked through it as yourself, without pretense, without performance, and somehow you gave my daughter her voice back, and gave me a reason to believe in this family's future again." He reached into his pocket, producing a small velvet box that made Nora's breath catch entirely. "I'm not interested in waiting years to be certain of something I already know," he said, opening the box to reveal a simple, elegant ring, nothing like the ostentatious jewelry she'd seen glittering on other women throughout the gala weeks earlier. "Nora Whitfield, will you marry me? Not because it solves any business problem or satisfies any board member, but because you are exactly who I want beside me, and exactly who Lily needs as her mother, for the rest of our lives." Nora looked down at the ring, then up at Damien's face, open and hopeful in a way she'd never seen from him during those early, guarded weeks at the beginning of their story. She thought of the 12 heiresses who had come before her, polished and impressive, and utterly unable to reach the people who mattered most in this house. She thought of her own modest apartment above the bakery, of her mother's lessons about showing up rather than performing, of every small, patient moment that had led her to this exact point in the garden, where a grieving family had slowly, carefully, learned to live again. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming freely down her face. "Yes, I'll marry you." Damien slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into an embrace that held all the relief and joy of everything they'd fought through to reach this moment. Inside the house, unseen by either of them, Lily had woken and wandered to her window, watching the two people who had rebuilt her world standing together beneath the balcony lights, and for the first time since her mother's passing, she smiled a full, unguarded smile, certain, in the quiet way children often are, that everything from this point forward would finally be all right. In the weeks that followed, the household settled into a new rhythm, one built not on performance or appearances, but on the small, steady rituals that had always mattered most to Lily. Story time under the oak tree continued every Sunday, joined now by Margaret as often as not, who had taken, somewhat awkwardly at first, to bringing a book of her own to read aloud when it was her turn. The mansion no longer felt too big or too quiet. It felt, for the first time since Caroline's passing, like a home built around the people inside it, rather than the reputation it needed to protect. Nora never stopped working at the library, and Lily became a regular fixture there too, curled up in the same reading corner where Nora had once helped a boy named Desmond find his voice, now helping other quiet, uncertain children find theirs in turn, simply by sitting nearby and showing them, patiently, that someone was willing to wait as long as it took.